Chapter 27, Lost. I don't know how long I slept, but when my eyes opened, the scene had changed. The treetops waved back and forth gently in a cold wind. The shadows had vanished or taken over as darkening clouds raced across the sky. I shivered and sat up. Somewhere far away, the buzz of a lone snowmobile sounded like a housefly. The clearing had lost its charm, and I started my snowmobile, anxious to find my way back to the others. I turned myself around to head back the way I came, then looked over my shoulder. I wondered how far back these mountains go. Probably 100 miles without another human being. Snow began to fall in flurries. I reached the place where I had come down a steep ridge into this narrow canyon, but didn't follow my meandering tracks, wanting to get back as quickly as possible. The path between trees grew narrow enough that I had to slow down. I hoped I wouldn't get stuck anywhere so tight that I couldn't go forward and couldn't turn around. For that matter, I hoped I was going in the right direction to take me back to the big clearing. I hadn't kept careful track of the little twists and turns I had followed all afternoon, and with the clouds covering the sky now, I couldn't use the sun to determine my direction. I looked up and watched which way the clouds blew past the treetops, trying to remember how that related to the sun's earlier position, then gave up. I knew I could go back and retrace my tracks if I had to. When I found a low, sloping hill to my left, I buzzed up and over it and was rewarded with a wider, more open canyon to follow. I squeezed the throttle harder and felt the cold wind press against my chest and circulate through my helmet. I dropped down a short, steep hill, catching air over a 6-foot-tall drift at the summit, then zooming down into a wide, open clearing. In the center stood the tallest pine I had seen all day. It must have been well over 100 years old. Its lower branches reached out and formed a circus tent-like opening with bare ground exposed below. A single sled track ran through the center of the meadow, and I wondered who had made it and how long ago and which direction they were going, as worries about getting myself lost nibbled at the edge of my mind. Another 5 minutes brought me to more tracks, and the surroundings began to look familiar. I occasionally shut off the engine to listen for other snow machines, but heard only silence and the wind moaning through the pines. The day had grown dark, the snow fell thicker, and I raced quickly on. 10 minutes later, the snow was falling hard in quarter-sized flakes. The large flakes indicated a big storm with plenty of moisture to dump as a warm, wet, high-pressure and cold, low-pressure system collided. By the time I reached the central clearing, no one remained, and 3 inches of new snow covered most of the day's tracks. I continued up the canyon toward the parking lot, ducked behind the windshield with my helmet visor closed. Dropping temperatures took some of the fun out of riding, and I could feel a dull ache in my arms and shoulders from the day's exertions. It was dark enough now that the sun must have been dropping over the horizon. I didn't regret that the day had ended as I reached the parking lot and found most of the other sleds already loaded in trucks and on trailers. No one seemed to have left yet. I stopped my sled behind Grandpa's truck and walked toward the other cars to find Annetta and see if she would ride home with me. Mr. Hall and Jim were talking near a trailer, and I overheard their conversation as I approached. "I'm going back to find her," Mr. Hall said. I noticed the concerned look on his face, and Jim turned toward me. "What's up?" I asked him. "Amy's not back. We're going to look for her. Wait here." Jim turned his back and helped Mr. Hall drag his sled from the trailer, then jogged away toward his own machine. The picture of the single track in the snow and the unfamiliar clearing with the giant pine tree flashed through my mind. Along with the image came the overwhelming feeling that I had experienced in the cemetery and 2 other times this week, only this time, instead of peace, I felt urgency. A calm voice inside my head, louder than I had ever heard my own thoughts, shouted, "Go!" The voice frightened me. Adrenaline poured into my veins and my heart raced. I looked around the parking lot and could barely see through the thick snowflakes filling the air. It occurred to me that the situation was serious. People die in storms like this, and there was no telling how long it would last. I didn't know the territory well, and I only had a few pieces of the winter survival gear that I should have carried with me. If I planned for a ski outing, I'd be prepared. I'd have enough food and water and clothing and gear to survive for days. But I didn't. I should just stay here. If I got myself stuck or lost, I would only endanger the others who would come looking for me. I looked down the canyon leading back to the clearing, and the urgency would not dissipate. It would not listen to reason. Panic welled up in my throat as I realized that the decision had already been made. I would listen to the voice. I would go back out into the storm. I would look for the clearing with the old tree. I pushed my fears to the back of my mind and jogged toward my snowmobile. I turned the key and the warm engine roared to life. I hit the gas and snow spewed out behind me as I spun around and headed down the canyon without looking back. Quarter-sized flakes fell everywhere, and the cold wind blew them across the ground before me. My headlight barely pierced 20 feet into the storm, but this part of the path was familiar now, and I skipped along at 40 miles per hour, just slowly enough to dodge the small pines that periodically appeared before me. I reached the meadow and pushed the sled even faster to the other side, then started up a canyon, dodging trees that appeared out of the storm. After riding about a mile, I realized I had picked the wrong canyon. I spun around quickly and headed back down. By the time the meadow came back into view, the drifting snow had all but obliterated even my own recent tracks. I took the next canyon and pushed on, hoping to spot a familiar landmark. 20 minutes later found me back in the meadow, trying the third canyon on that end of the clearing. This had to be the one. Unless Amy was lucky enough to find her way out, or at least find good shelter, a storm like this could kill her. The thick curtain of falling snow would disorient her. The wind chill would drop the temperature below zero, and if she got wet, she would lose heat even faster. Within hours, she could freeze to death. I had no idea what had become of Mr. Hall and Jim, so I couldn't count on them. If I didn't find Amy in this canyon, I wouldn't know what else to do. The snow grew deeper by the minute, 2 or 3 feet in some places where the wind blew it into drifted piles, and the dropping temperatures made it light and fluffy. Even Grandpa's sled with its long track and deep lugs was beginning to bog down and nearly get stuck in the deepest spots if I didn't keep up my speed. I rode on through the storm, wondering what I would do when, or if, I found Amy. I remembered the voice in my head, though, and put any thought of failure out of my mind. Perhaps 5 minutes later, I was rewarded with a familiar sight. Up ahead, I spotted the tall pine tree. The single track had run through this ravine, and I had seen this place in my mind when the voice told me to move. I sped through the clearing, wondering where to look now that I had found my way here. Just as I passed the tree, I noticed an irregular-shaped bump in the snow that had not been there before. My headlight illuminated the shape as it drew near, and I recognized the outline of a snowmobile's large front end and long seat. It looked half buried, its nose pointing upward, its tracks submerged and stuck in the snow. I cranked the handlebars hard left, narrowly avoiding an impact with the tail of the sled. Before me now I saw the steep hill and was struck with an idea of what to do next. Before I had time to consider the outcome, I squeezed the throttle hard and charged toward the hill with all the speed I could gather. I couldn't see a thing at this speed. The snowflakes came at me in long, white streaks, as if I were about to jump to light speed. When I hit the hillside abruptly, moving at least 50 miles per hour, it nearly bounced me from the seat, but I gripped the handlebars tightly and continued squeezing the throttle all the way open. Somewhere above me in the darkness, the giant cornice loomed. This time, I would not turn to the side and dodge it. I was playing chicken with a stationary object, and I had a pretty good idea which of us was about to win. I only hoped my plan would work. The headlight illuminated a dim white mass through the storm. I held on for half a second longer, then jumped. Above the sound of snow in my ears as I tumbled up the steep hill through the deep soft powder came a sickening thud and crunch as the sled embedded itself in the hard drift. It was louder than I had expected as the fiberglass engine cowling cracked and the plastic windshield shattered. I jumped to my feet, looking up, ears sharp, listening and watching through the storm for any sound or sign of snow tumbling down, thinking for the first time that the crash could cause the entire cornice to break away and slide, crushing and burying me in the process. The engine had killed on impact. Only the rushing sound of wind and the crystal tinkling of drifting snow against my coat met my ears. Again, I was struck by the peace and beauty of the scene, but this time I couldn't afford the luxury of stopping to enjoy it. I scrambled up the slope and grabbed the back of the snowmobile. The force of the crash had buried it over halfway into the drift. I braced myself as well as I could and pulled backward. The sled didn't budge an inch. I tugged and pulled and jerked with all my strength against the sled, but made no headway. It was lodged in solid. I had gone too fast. I stopped and leaned against the sled, breathing hard, looking down toward the pine tree where Amy must be huddled. "Dear God," I whispered, "I could use a little help here." It was no use trying to see above the clouds this time. "I know you can hear me. I've gotten myself into a bit of trouble, I'm afraid. Could you help me move this snowmobile? I don't know what I'll do if I can't move this thing." I took 2 deep breaths and started pulling again. Minutes later, I was hot and winded. I leaned against the sled again, then let myself fall to the snow to catch my breath. I hadn't budged it an inch. It was hopeless. I had no chance of dragging it from the drift. Why did I think of this crazy idea in the first place? And why did I follow through without stopping to reconsider first? I couldn't even get solid footing in the soft snow. I glanced sideways to survey the useless damage I had caused to the wonderful machine, and a new idea hit me square in the face. I rolled over and started digging and scooping snow from beneath the sled, pushing it out and down the hill. Soon, part of the track was hanging free. I stood again and yanked on the seat. This time, it moved. Less than half an inch, but it moved. Thank you, God. I dug at the snow below the snowmobile again, then set my feet and pulled for all I was worth, pulling and heaving with all my weight until the sled began to break free. Soon it came a foot at a time, and then it was out, laying up the slope under my new snow cave. I crawled into the cave and used my gloved hands to dig and scrape the floor flat. I punched holes into the back of the cave, then removed entire blocks of snow at a time. The snow piled easily out the hole below me, and 20 minutes later, the cave had grown barely large enough to fit 2 people tightly inside. After backing out of the cave, I ran down the hill, following my tracks back to the tree. I ducked below its massive lower branches, and sure enough, there sat Amy, huddled against the trunk, balled up tight and shivering. "What happened?" Amy asked, looking up with glazed eyes. "It sounded like you crashed." Her speech came out slurred and slow. "I did," I said, happy and relieved to see her. "Some rescue this is," she said, smiling through chattering teeth. "Come on," I said. "I've got a place all set up for us." "I'm going to stay here," she said slowly. "It's warmer here." Amy was slipping into the middle stages of hypothermia. The freezing ground and wind that made its way through these branches had lowered her core body temperature enough to slow her thinking and slur her speech. A few hours longer, and she would have frozen for sure. Her body was already losing its ability to generate heat. If she stopped shivering, that's when I'd really start worrying. Even now, without any real protection from the cold, I was afraid it could be too late. "Come with me, Amy," I said again, taking her hands and pulling her up. "I want to stay here," she said again, but didn't resist. I led her away from the tree, and we laboriously climbed the loose slope to the cave. With each step we took up the mountain, our feet slid halfway back down through the powder. I put one arm around Amy's waist and helped her along as best I could. At the snowmobile, I brushed off the snow and pulled the pack from the back. It took a few minutes to make it the next 15 feet to the cave, but once there, I took the foil-coated thermal tarp from the pack and laid it inside the cave. "Crawl in here," I told Amy. She didn't respond until I lifted one of her arms over my neck and helped her to stand. "You can go back to sleep after we get inside, okay?" This promise stirred her a little, and she crawled inside and lay down on the tarp. I crawled behind her into the pitch-black interior, sitting beside her and ducking below the low roof. I pulled off my gloves and fumbled through the pack to find the ancient chemical heat packs, opening them and shaking them to get them working. Hopefully, they still had a little heat left. Unzipping Amy's coat, I slid heat packs under her arms and put others against her neck, anywhere near her core where the blood ran close to the surface. Warming her too quickly, I knew, could be dangerous. Toxins had built up in the blood in her extremities that had nearly ceased to circulate, and anything that would start the cold blood moving again too quickly could shock the heart and kill her. I unzipped my own coat and lay down, wrapping my arms around Amy and pulling the tarp around us as best I could. I was still hot, and it felt good to cool down as my body heat warmed Amy. I had done everything I could now except keep Amy awake until she was out of danger. "Okay, Amy, you have to talk to me for a minute now." "Oh, Spencer, I was so cold, but I'm warm now," she said, drifting off to sleep. "Amy, tell me about Netta," I tried. "Oh, she's my sister. She likes you a lot." "What else?" "That's all. Good night. Sleep tight." We kept talking like that until Amy's body began to warm up. I moved the heat packs from time to time. Soon chilblains set in, and Amy cried and squirmed at the intense, stinging, needle-like pain in her feet and fingertips. It was then that I knew she was out of danger. I stroked her hair to comfort her as the pain passed, and then she fell asleep in my arms. My thoughts turned to Jim and Mr. Hall, still riding somewhere out in the storm. They would keep moving at least, and the electric warmers on the handlebars would keep them from any serious danger of hypothermia. And they had each other to help. They would make it through the storm all right, one way or another. Outside our tiny snow cave, the wind howled on, and the sound of snow skiffing along and dropping at the cave entrance continued through the dark. Chapter 28, Meadows and Moonlight. I don't know when I dozed off, but I awoke in the darkness, stiff and cold on the bottom half of my body. Amy still slept, curled up next to me, breathing softly in my face. The cave was pitch black, and the sounds of wind and falling snow had ceased. I stirred, trying to get a little more comfortable, and I heard Amy's breathing pattern change as she awoke. "Good morning, dear," she said as she began to get her bearings. "Where are we?" "Alive and warm," I answered, "in a snow cave. It sounds like the storm's over." We both rolled over as much as possible in our cramped quarters and scooted toward the entrance, which had sealed itself off with the drifting snow that settled there. I kicked the hole bigger, and we crawled outside. The full moon hung low on the western horizon in a cloudless black sky. The air was cold but dry, and the snow-covered ground sparkled beautifully in the moonlight. We found Grandpa's sled where I left it, buried in 2 feet of new snow. We brushed it off and found the windshield shattered, the engine cover cracked, and the headlight crushed. We each grabbed one of the skis and pulled sideways until the sled was pointing almost downhill. A few tries with the ignition had the engine purring. At least that didn't seem damaged. I sat down, and Amy stepped on behind me, still wrapped tight in the silver tarp. She put one arm around my waist, and I hit the gas. At first, we only inched forward through the deep powder, but the steep hill got us moving as loose snow tumbled along beside us. I squeezed the throttle wide, and we continued moving slowly, but didn't get stuck as the weight of 2 people provided extra traction. The full moon supplied plenty of light to find our way down the canyon, and soon the central clearing where we had eaten lunch opened up before us. The snow here had been exposed to more wind, and the packed drifts below the spinning track provided ample traction as the long tread bit in and sent us speeding smoothly along. Across the clearing, 2 snowmobile headlights appeared. One was stopped, and we watched the other fly toward it, turning off at the last possible moment and continue on for another 50 yards before it, too, slowed and stopped, bogged down in powder. By this time, the first had pulled itself onto the other's trail and repeated the maneuver. We crossed the open space with the full moon illuminating our way and pulled up alongside a sled just as it came to a slow halt. "Daddy!" Amy yelled, jumping off her sled toward her father. "Oh, Amy!" he sobbed, relief gushing freely from his tired eyes. He was soaked through from having driven, no doubt, all throughout the storm, from digging his and Jim's snowmobiles out of the powder again and again. Amy jumped into his arms. "Relax, Daddy," she whispered. "I'm fine. Spencer took good care of me." Mr. Hill turned toward me, still clinging tightly to his daughter, and shook my hand heartily. "Thank you, Spencer," he said, his voice low and husky. "Thank you." He didn't let go of my hand, but pulled me toward him and hugged me too. I hugged him back, sandwiching Amy between us. Jim pulled up then, and Amy ran through the deep snow to hug him too. "Jimmy, you're soaked. What are you doing outside on a night like this?" she scolded. "You just won't stay out of trouble, will you, girl?" he chided back. "You done good, boy," he said, turning to me. He stepped over to me through the snow and shook my hand firmly, then glanced down at the crumpled front end of my sled. "I told you couldn't handle this machine." We both laughed and shook hands even harder through our thick gloves.